very much. So really just to remind everybody that we will be giving away a book at the end of the session. And I know it's a bit of a tricky situation, but we'll try to get that person that maybe asked the most thought-provoking question, excluding John, because he tends to ask quite a few thought-provoking questions. Um, just a interesting story. I attended a few of John's sessions at Data Modeling Zone. That was the very first one, and I liked his approach of having those slides, walked around, and I think he challenged me in terms of looking at my phone at one stage. And at that stage, I was actually using the WhatsApp Llama thing to understand the difference between vectors and embeddings and things like that. So that was it was a challenging situation. And John, I do know that you really affected Marco Werbin's wife, Jody. I'm sure you remember her. She always asked lots and lots of questions, and really just and really just trying to get to understand what this thing's all about. So that's what I really enjoyed. And I must admit, since I've been back, I've done my own RAG and LLM and created one using PDFs and things like that. And I think we all need to learn and understand what it's all about, not to be afraid of it, but to recognize the potential and the things we can do. And I thought John did a fantastic job of sharing that with us. So it wasn't a heavy note-taking session. So John, I do know that you are very happy to handle any question whenever it is. What I'll try to do is almost just try to manage the questions if people put up their hands. Please, if you wouldn't mind just putting up your hand and asking, and then I'll try to filter them through to John so we can just allocate them one at a time. John, thank you very much. Thank you for your time. It was really nice listening to you in the DMZ and hopefully today as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Howard. Thanks, Debbie. Really, really kind of you to invite me to your meeting. Truly pleased and happy to be here. Yeah, I tend to, try to make these sessions either in person or remotely as interactive as possible. So I'll talk for 20 minutes, something like that, about my experiences, my background, things that I've done. And that generally sets a good context for people to understand, oh, I can ask about this or I can ask about that. And, people say it all the time, but there really are no dumb questions. This is an exploding area of opportunity, generative AI and all the technologies that come around it. The book is actually about our longer journey to artificial general intelligence. So a little bit about me. I started in the AI world about 30 years ago. I've been working for 38 years now. And I've worked at IBM, Dell. Most recently, I was the global head of AI at EY and built one of the world's largest private secure Gen AI environment that supports 300,000 people on a daily basis. I've been involved in 20 different industries. I've been parts of teams, or I've done myself, where we've built and implemented into production over 100 predictive analytic applications. So, if you want to talk about the flow of oil in a mayonnaise plant, I'm happy to do that. Or, if you want to talk about credit risk, we can do that. Or the way to, reduce post-surgical sepsis in gastrointestinal surgeries, we can talk about that too. So lots of different areas, lots of different applications, huge amounts of data. And it's just been a joy to do this for almost 40 years. So why did I write the book is what some people ask me. There's lots of books out there. Why would you even take the time to, bang out another one? This is my 5th book, by the way. So I was listening to Elon Musk and Sam Altman and Ray Kurzweil and people of that ilk, and saying that, artificial general intelligence is here. It's going to be here in 6 months. It'll be here in 6 weeks. And I just don't agree with that. I don't know if anybody in the group remembers Rodney or knows Rodney Brooks. Rodney was the founding director of MIT's CSAIL Institute and has created a couple robotics companies. Someone that I think is very smart and quite accomplished. He's the only person I know that says that artificial general intelligence is further out in time than I say. I say it's 125 years. He says it's 130 years. So he's got me by 4 years. So, and Rodney and I have never spoken. We don't know each other. We've never spoken. It's just that, we look at this from a very pragmatic, practical perspective. I would imagine many people on this call already know that we've been working on AI for 70 years. It's been around that long. This is not a new field. We have generative AI, we have causal AI, we have foundational AI. Some people call foundational AI traditional AI or analytic AI, goes by different terms, but it's clustering, classification, all the things that we've done for many, many, many years. So, I've looked at that very carefully, and it's taken us 70 years to get to where we are now. Now, the last 2.5 years with generative AI have been an explosive time. There's no doubt about it. We've gone from, most of us have worked with 10% of the world's information, structured information, rows, columns, numbers, all that kind of stuff. But at this point, we are able to use 100% of the world's information. And if you include synthetic data, it's 100 plus percent.
Yeah.
So this is a completely different world that we're in right now. Here we are in a DEMA meeting, and as Howard said, he went back home and he grabbed some PDFs and started to build a RAG environment using an LLM. And, this is a brave new world. So, we used to use 10%, Pontiac. Okay. Well, I grew up near Pontiac, but that's in Michigan. So that's a different Pontiac, I think. But we're in a world where we used to work on 10% of the world's information, but we downsampled that to about 1%. So we've gone from really effectively using 1% of the world's information to 100 plus. That's a game-changing environment. The great thing about it is that all the things that you've learned throughout your careers about information management and data apply to what we're going to do in the future. If you know good information management practices and you know how to build systems that are reliable and accountable and accurate, you could do that in the Gen AI world. So, there's a whole great deal of change in this world. But then again, when you get down to fundamental principles, it hasn't changed that much. We still get information out of sources. We bring it together. We structure it in different ways. We load it into data environments. We run models over it. That hasn't changed. It's just the way that, the models are and the things the models do are different. Howard, go ahead.
Yeah, I did battle in the first one in terms of understanding exactly what you meant by artificial general intelligence, and I know you challenged us in terms of the time frame. And so yes, AI has been with us for a long time. So what is that exact difference, and what makes it so long, so far out?
Yeah, it's a great question. And in its core, it's central to what we're talking about today. Artificial general intelligence, and I agree with Elon Musk and Ray Kurzweil and all the people that I mentioned earlier, I agree with them 100% on this point, is that the idea of artificial general intelligence is that an AI is as capable and as smart and responsive and intelligent as an above average person.
Yeah.
So, Howard and I met in Phoenix. We were talking about his T-shirt, which brought us into motorcycles and, different shared interests and things like that. And I can guarantee, I have a very good memory. So I can guarantee if I don't see Howard for another 10 years, 15 years, when I see him again, the first thing I'm going to talk about is motorcycles. Because I remember that interaction. I remember that T-shirt. It was really fun and enjoyable for me. One of the problems with AGI is that it has no memory. So, you put things, or AI, not AGI, we're nowhere near AGI, but, you put things into AI and it doesn't have any memory. So the idea of AGI, to define it more clearly, is an AI that has all the faculties of an above average human being. So memory, recognition, recollection, empathy, all the different things that we have as a person, AI should have those things. And then Howard said, another thing was, why is it going to take so long to get there? So I went back and looked very carefully at what has happened over the last 70 years. And honestly, Siri can't even get you to the right Starbucks, let alone do heart surgery. So, I looked at it very carefully. And one of the things, AI at this point has no memory. Another thing is that it can't, it can't even write well. There's all these tests that they run AI against and these large language models against, and they don't do very well. Yes, they're very good at rote memorization. They're very good at finding out 2 + 2 and, complicated math formulas, but there's really nothing there, as far as the subtlety of creativity or how humans think or how they interact or understanding things over the long term. So, Howard, I have a hand up in my display, but I don't have
Yeah,
any
it's
names or
Michael.
anything.
It's Michael. Michael?
Yeah, hi, John. Just a quick one. So, two things came to mind. The first is simply when we talk about a capable AI, I think there's a distinction between AIs and AI ecosystems. That's what's one thing. But also, the other thing I was thinking about that's of really great concern to me coming from data is the prevalence of synthetic data and also the potential for different types of, I guess, data poisoning, or in other words, you can actually have a very intelligent AI that has learned a lot, 100% of the information. But if that information is garbage or repetition of the same thing, then it's not really adding extra value. I think things like entropy need to be taken into account with regard to the data that's also being produced. I was just thinking about that.
Yeah, it's true. AI systems are a bit more dangerous in the fact that, you can weaponize data much more easily and quickly than you can in more deterministic systems. So synthetic data is a double-edged sword. There's no doubt about it, Michael. The way I tend to think about it is that, we have data sets that have shortcomings or biases or have skew in them. Synthetic data can be used to remedy all of that. When people come to me and say, oh, well, there's not enough women in this data set, or there's not enough minorities, or there's not enough high volume transactions or high value transactions, I said, well, what do you think is balanced? What do you think is fair? And then generate synthetic data and include that into the data set, and you can take away those biases or skew any way you want. But your concern around data poisoning and people putting in data for misinformation or nefarious purposes is absolutely true. We have to be careful of that, and we have to govern those environments very carefully.
Thanks.
Yeah, and then you had said something else, Michael, that was really important is that, AGI, to get to AGI, we're going to have an AI ecosystem. This idea of using a model, it's almost quaint at this point because, most people, when you're sending in, prompts to an environment, you're sending in a prompt to an ensemble of models. You're not using a model. So as we move towards AGI, we're going to see an integration of causal AI, generative AI, and foundational AI. So, Michael, you're prescient in your remark in that almost everything that we do on a sophisticated level on a going forward basis is going to be around an ensemble of models, not just a model.
Cool. Yeah, thanks.
Sure.
We
Thank
had
you.
a we had a question from Quinton. Yes, Quinton.
Hi, I'm pretty much an amateur to AI, but something prompted me from your conversation around memory. What's stopping us creating capabilities around memory similar to humans? So for me, memory is storing events and then imprinting relevance to them. We use emotions, but obviously computers would have to use something else. What's stopping us from creating that capability for AI?
Nothing's great question, Quentin. Nothing's stopping us. It's just that it hasn't been done yet. If you think about OpenAI and Mistral and Cohere and all the different LLM vendors that are out there, they're very focused on building the next biggest, greatest, and most capable model. They are looking at architectures, but there really isn't anybody out there that has built a short-term, mid-term, long-term memory architecture to augment large language models. It just doesn't exist because no one's done it. If you go out and search on the web, the internet, you'll find research papers where researchers around the world are talking about augmenting AI with memory, but it just hasn't gone from university and research to early stage innovation and practicality. That alone is going to take quite some time. My projection is that we'll see what I'm calling composite AI, where generative AI, foundational AI, and causal AI come together as a composite system. Right now, we have large language models, we have analytics and small models, we have, statistics and things like that. But, it's going to take us at least 20 to 30 years to bring those all together into one AI system. And once we have that, then we can take off on the harder problems. Well, we'll probably work on the harder problems simultaneously, but we'll have more bandwidth to work on the harder problems of actually moving towards, AGI. Annie's with us. That's great.
Yes, William.
I've got a quick question. As far as the hype cycle that's going on with business and the confusion around generative AI, all the various ones that you've mentioned, etc., it reminds me of the early days of data. We're talking like 20 odd years back, where everybody just wanted some resource and they grabbed any name and they used it out there, and it was just a time of huge confusion. How do we bring the business back into, hold on guys, just slow down, because this is not where we're heading to? How do we do this? Because it's really creating trouble.
Yes. Yeah, it really is creating trouble. You're absolutely right in that, over the last 2 years when I worked at EY, I just left EY about a month ago, I guess, or maybe 3 weeks ago. I traveled around the world and I spoke to over 400 companies at the board level, the C-suite level, senior vice president level, those kind of levels. And there was almost a panic. We're behind. We've got to get into this game. This has got to happen. And I told each and every one of them, yeah, you might be behind because you haven't started, but there's very few companies out there, and most of them are the leading firms in the world that have actually done something that is going to make a difference in their operations and their profitability. So I always tried to bring into the conversation a sense of realism and reality. And while these models are great and they're fantastic to use, and all the different vendors I've mentioned have, really impressive model capabilities, you have to have a sense of context in what you want to do with these models. And the bottom line is these are not magic models. They're probabilistic models. And I remember when we released our first system in EY, the auditors got a hold of it and they put in a prompt and then they changed the prompt, or they wouldn't even change the prompt. They just put the prompt back in again into the same model, and they would get slightly different responses. And the auditors just really didn't like that at all. They're like, hey, every system I ask a question, I should get the same answer each and every time. And the bottom line is these are probabilistic systems. They don't work like that. So we as technology professionals and data professionals need to make sure that we're getting to the executives and having a conversation that's based in reality and rationality. We can build some really interesting and valuable and powerful systems, but they do need to be in the context of, trying to understand how to write better emails or respond better to customer service requests, or understanding, how our customers are going to respond to different marketing offers. These systems are not just, out in the wild. They always operate within some context of business.
You're right. And part of the challenge is that we fight the vendors on this, because if they can make an extra buck by saying that they've got AI in this thing, boy, they're going to do it right.
Oh yeah,
And
well, yeah.
and then we run into that challenge. Anyway,
And I
very
mean,
interested to hear what the rest of you, what you're going to
I
say.
mean, William, the thing is, we had the same problem with BI, right? And
Yeah,
BI
exactly.
still
That's exactly what
sells
I'm
very
saying.
well. But what we do know is that, the same thing happens is when you get bad data in, then BI leaves. But we have another question. Anupam.
Hello, thank you, Howard, and thank you, John, for doing this all together. I have a couple of questions, but I just want to place them first. First question first, how do you see, that's again a predictive thing. How do you see in terms of ethical considerations? Because if we say that, okay, AGI is a little bit near to human brain, or maybe I would say equal to human brains, right? So does those ethical considerations are being taken care while building these models? Because we saw a lot and lot in a very recent example, in one of the China showroom, there is one small robot kidnap the others, right? So how do you see that in AGI? That's going to be more mature, or what kind of thing, and where the humanity is going to be tackle that stuff and all,
Yeah, I'll take that one first, and then we'll go to your second question after we have a back and forth on this. I don't think any of us in this meeting we have to really worry about the ethics of AGI because we'll be long dead by the time AGI comes around. But in regular AI, we do need to be interested in ethics, and we do need to care about it. The great thing about models, and also the downside about models, is they're not very smart. They will do exactly what you tell them to do. Part of the problem that we have with AI, even the AI we have today, is that it's accessible by almost everybody in the world. I mean, I know in the third world there's internet access and electricity and food shortage and scarcity, and they have other concerns. But in the developed world, almost everybody can access these models, and that is problematic because most of the people in the world are not trained to think in a structured way. If
Yeah.
you're a developer or a data modeler or a technologist, you think in a structured way. And if you do think in a structured way, then you're better off because you're literally programming with your native language, whether that's Hindi or English or Dene or whatever it is.
Yeah.
The great thing about these models is if you put in each model, many of you already know this, each model has a system prompt. And those are the things that the vendor has put in there. You cannot respond with hate speech. You have to do this. You have to do that. Those kind of things. Then the end users put in their prompts, and the system prompt is appended to their prompt, and it's run into the model. And soon there will be an intermediary prompt, and you can actually create this today through different engineering and system philosophy, is that for your company or your organization, you can put in another level of prompts that say none of your responses can contravene the ethics of the organization. None of your responses can go outside the code of conduct. None of your responses should bring harm to either the company or any person associated in the company or alive or living or dead. You can do these things where you can constrain the operation of the model to act in a very ethical way, which is it's a wonderful thing. These models will only do what they're told. And if you are very careful about what you tell them to do, ethics really shouldn't be your biggest concern.
Okay. I think, good news, or, what we can say, it's not good news for, when we working, that AGI age, when we working with that one. Is that something like that, or
Can you say that? Can you say that again? I couldn't hear you very well. I'm sorry.
okay, no worries. I'm saying that it's going to be a good news for the humans during that time then, or uh, what is the consideration going to be? Is it in a good time during,
Right. Yeah, there's a great deal of concern in at least in the United States and probably around the world too. I also teach at the University of Michigan, and I have undergraduate students and I have graduate students, and they're all very concerned about jobs. You know, when they leave the university, are there going to be entry-level jobs, or all the entry-level jobs going to be taken by AIs? And I tell them, I said, that's not going to happen. We need people, from an employment perspective. And the other side of that is that, I think that this is probably one of the greatest times to be a person, be a
Okay.
human, because the simplistic things, AI is going to do that. The mechanistic stuff, people are always talking about, oh, we're not going to have any more developers, programmers are going to be obsolete. That's not true. That's not going to happen for decades and decades from now. Because if you look at the way AGI develops, it's very good for incrementing and decrementing counters and cleaning registers and doing simple things. It can generate that kind of code. It's really good at that. When we were at EY, we had committed 4 million lines of AI generated code. And everybody goes, oh my gosh, it's the end of development. But that was 22% of the code generated. The other 88% or 78% of it was garbage. So, AI is not taking over the world. AI will not take over the world. And it's going to be a long time before it gets, good enough to where it can replace all kinds of people. So I don't think we have any short or medium term concerns about, is there a role for people in this equation?
Okay. And the work is being started already, John, for moving towards AGI, and when we expect the first model to be in next 10 years or something like that?
No, if you listen to, other people, they say it's here now, which I don't agree with. My view is that over the next 20 to 30 years, we're going to see composite AI. And after that, then we're going to see real movement towards artificial general intelligence. So more than likely, all the people that are on this call will be retired by the time we have any kind of, rudimentary AGI. So I think it's going to be quite some time before we get there.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
You for answering and listening. This is
Thanks.
really
Thanks, Anya. Michael?
Yes, hi. So
Hi.
this discussion actually triggered a couple of things. That's why I raised my hand.
They always do.
Yes. And when it comes to ethics, and there's ethics and memory, I keep wondering if there are limits to ethics, given the fact that if you remember the movie The Invention of Lying by Ricky Gervais, everyone tells the truth. All of a sudden, one person discovers lying, and this one person is able to manipulate everyone else. And to the extent that we don't know what to call this, that machine, whether we call it deception or machines hiding intentions or whatever it is. I know that we're straying a little bit, but I was just wondering about the implications of that from an ethical perspective. Is there some kind of steady state we reach whereby there is some implication with regard to the feasibility of having a really ethical solution, or will there always be bad eggs prevalent who could disrupt the entire ecosystem? And of course, that brings me back to this notion of this anthropomorphic lens through which we view AI. Sometimes I keep asking myself the question, is it always the most appropriate way to view things? Can we taint AI with our own human limitations? And to some degree, the data may allow us to perpetuate that in AI, but at some point, there has to be maybe a more inclusive paradigm that's not just so anthropomorphic, if you like. But yeah.
Yeah, Michael, you've strayed onto a beautiful thread of discussion, and I really enjoy this dialogue. So thank you for bringing it to the fore. We have to remember that these models, the models we have today, they don't reason, they don't think, they don't have any original thoughts at all. So anthropomorphizing these models is totally inappropriate. I actually caution people about using pronouns with models, because that's the first step in the direction of thinking that these models have some kind of, ability to even, rudimentarily reason, and they don't. You know, you hear from the different vendors out there, oh, we're building reasoning models. They're not building reasoning models the way we reason. They're building models that infer, and they're building models that do recursive processing. That's not thinking. That's not reasoning. You know, we're nowhere near that. So, you know, as far as the models, you know, themselves being deceptive, they can't be, because they don't have the capacity to have original thought. Maybe in 30 to 50 years they will, but at this point they don't. So I never worry about, you know, models deceiving people or providing misleading information, because they're not capable of that. And, you know, as I said earlier, if you really want to constrain the model, all you have to do is, you know, either include it in your individual prompt or put it in your system prompt where the model is forbidden from doing those kind of things or prohibited from doing those kind of things. There's a difference in the way I talk about things. Models themselves, I never suggest anybody anthropomorphize a model, because they're just, it's like, you know, there's just, I mean, your dog has more mental capacity or reasoning capacity than these models do. And I love dogs, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way about dogs. You know, then, you know, when we start to talk about agents, that's a little different. I don't suggest that we anthropomorphize agents, but I do suggest we think about agents in the context of a person, because an agent can actually do everything a person can do. So now you have agents that can bind you to a contract, agents can spend money, agents can do different things. So we have to think about those in a little bit more holistic mode than we do models. So I don't worry about models, you know, going astray, because they really can't.
Cool. Yeah, thanks. There was also the final thing I wanted to say about this bidirectional influence. So to the
Mhm.
extent that we train these AI models, there's also some way that they train us. So for example, I think there was a
Sure.
recent study where some teachers got some students together and told them to use ChatGPT to write their essays.
Mhm.
And the end result was that the students were convinced after that to stop using ChatGPT for a number of reasons, and also the discussion around people becoming quote unquote stupid because they don't really learn stuff properly, and now they're relying too much on that. And if you compound that effect over time, what does it do to us as a society if we're reliant on outsourcing certain things, whether it's they might not think like we do, but certain things like calculation and generation and automation sort of leave us less capable. But it's just that
Mhm.
interaction as well, you know, if there is some long-term
Yeah.
societal implication for that. Thanks.
Oh, there certainly are. You know, I mean, how many how many of you, you know, I'm, you know, probably as old or older than everybody in the room, but you know, I used to have everybody's phone number memorized. You know, I remembered everybody's phone number, you know, but now all I have is like three in my head, you know,
Yeah.
because I just pick up my mobile phone and, you know, tap and it dials the number. So, you know, that's a simplistic example that, you know, if you don't do things, you know, if you don't repeat things or you don't practice things, you lose that capability. So there is a fair amount of dialogue right now about what is the, you know, anthropomorphic or historical or evolutionary, you know, damage of these models on the human capability. And I think it's a serious conversation to have, because if we completely outsource all our thinking to models, that's not going to be good for the, you know, the human capacity from a mental perspective. Now we're straying into metaphysics and, you know, sociology and psychology and all those things, which is wonderful.
So I think one of the problems that we're sitting with is a lot of this, the ship has kind of sailed, and because you speak to the younger generation and you tell them something, the first thing they do is they pick up their phone, they go to Google, they Google it, and they come back and tell you, no, you're wrong. Meantime, back at the ranch, there's all sorts of nuances and things like that, context that they don't have, things like this. And then Google isn't always up to date, correct, etc. So it comes back down to the quality of putting whatever we're going to put into this thing. And then how do we maintain that as relevant and true? And I'm not sure that we have the capability, or maybe even I don't want to use the word aptitude, but the go to actually go about fixing quality. It's like, okay, well, we just know it's like 60, 70% quality. That's good. Well, we'll just go with it. And we will deal with the fact that the invoice is not going to get paid because this address wasn't correct, and that's fine. We'll just factor that in, etc. I think as human beings have really got to step up.
Yeah, I agree with you, William. Absolutely true. You know, one of the things that I want to bring into this conversation is that these models, you know, the large language models from all the different vendors that I've mentioned, Google and all those companies, they're going to be out there. That's part of our world going forward. That's not going to change. But what can change and what will change and what is changing now is that large language models are not the end all and be all. As I said earlier, there's ensembles of models. One of the last things I did before I left EY is I ran a project where we built our own small language model or domain language model. So going forward in the future, you know, we'll have, you know, 100 large language models, maybe 1,000 large language models, but we will have tens of thousands and maybe millions of domain language models and small language models. So just as you were talking about, these large language models are basically trained on the breadth and the depth of the internet. And we know the internet's full of things that are not true and patently untrue in some cases, deliberately so untrue in many cases. So we shouldn't rely on those models as the basis of our processing, as the basis of things that should be 100% accurate. Like you said, pulling an address on an invoice is not something that is a, you know, Gen AI problem. That's a file retrieval question. You know, we shouldn't be using AI for things that AI is not good for. So, you know, the future of models, and we'll have lots and lots of models. We'll have large language models, small language models. We'll have all the natural language processing models that we've ever built in the past. And all of those are going to work together. And this is just in the Gen AI field. They're all going to work together to bring back answers that have the highest degree of accuracy and transparency possible. So we've been talking about in this conversation as if, you know, large language models are the only things that are out there and we can't control them. That is true. They're not the only things that are out there, but we can't control them because we don't own them. But we can certainly build our own models that we wrap around those, or we make large language models part of our ecosystem, and we rely on our models for the things that have to be of a higher degree of accuracy, and we want transparency, and we want ethics. So we have a lot more control in this ecosystem than we've been led to believe. So I don't worry about these models running amok because these models are just one part of our ecosystem, and there's going to be more and more and more models that we build and control.
100%. So that's the kind of the other side of the sword, because when you look at a generative AI, I would hope, and I'm probably wrong, but I would hope that there's some kind of central logic around the definition of the terminology. But when you go into everybody building their own for their own domain from their own context of their own company, then that's all well and good if you only fish in your own pond. But as soon as you start flowing information from one lineage source or destination through into other areas to reports and all the rest of it, then you run into the whole definition issue, and that's when, you know, things kind of creep in. So there has to be some kind of a happy space between these two.
Yeah, I think you're right, William. There is no, you know, central catalog, you know, out there between the large language models that invoice is invoice is invoice. That's just not the way it works. You know, but when you get into your pond, to continue your metaphor, you can certainly control that. And that's really up to you and how much time and effort you want to put into that and how much value it actually delivers to you and your organization. So one of the most hopeful things I think about this entire conversation is that the rise of generative AI has made the role of people who are focused on data, so much more important. Because now we went from, like I said, 10 to 1%, or 1 to 10% of the information to 100% of the information. One of the early systems, Gen AI systems we built about almost 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago now, we gave to an external client, a very large technology company who was a big partner of ours. And, they went in and asked questions. And the first 3 questions, they came back and said, your model is garbage. It doesn't work. And it was a retrieval augmented generation environment, a RAG environment. And we went back and looked, and the problem was that the data was inaccurate. The system was pulling back exactly what it should, but they had given us documentation that was old and hadn't been updated. So, if you really think about it, how many of us have gone out and audited, all the content in all the systems in every organization to ensure that it's 100% accurate and up to date? None of us have. At least I haven't met anybody that's done it yet. But now with Gen AI, it's crucial. If you're going to go out and suck in all the documentation from your HR system, you're going to have to audit it first.
Yeah. And John, what you're saying is almost echoed by Andrew and Guy. He's one of the thought leaders, and he's saying that we've got to come back to data management before we get this AI progressing. And I really like that in terms of recognizing that, this AI is moving so quick, but if we can't get the fundamentals right, we're in lots of trouble.
Yeah. And the great thing about it is that you don't have to sit on the sidelines. You don't have to audit every PDF that was ever generated. Yeah. You can take the information and jam it into an embeddings database, an embedding structure, and a graph database, or a whatever data structure you want to use, and you can use AI to audit it. So then you can say, okay, we took all the information out of the HR systems, we put it in, and we found that 40% of the documents are inaccurate.
Yeah, and I love that. I think we do have to recognize those challenges and then be able to deal with ambiguity. How do we manage ambiguity? It's not going to go away. Yes, it would be nice that we've always used the same terminology, but as you say, documents change, things change, and the terminology changes. Yes, Michael.
Yeah, funny you should mention ambiguity, because I was thinking along the lines, but slightly different. So I know that we have the AGI notion, but I was also thinking, do we have the AGE? So the artificial general explainability. And the reason I was saying that is simply when you have high stakes decision-making contexts, then you often have cases where you have moral ambiguities or ethical dilemmas. And so now it's not just the data, but what the data represent and how they're interpreted. And to the extent that you have these AIs as inference machines to some degree, it's sort of almost impossible to completely remove them from embedded values, because values determine hierarchies and things like that. So if you had an ethical dilemma and you had to make a choice, that choice will have to be informed by something. Now, as humans, sometimes we might want to sort of push that responsibility and say, look, this is what the machine says, and not have to deal with it ourselves. So it goes back to my point about outsourcing certain things. But I think in high stakes decision making cases where we have issues that are potentially really significant, then we need to have this ability to explain things as well, and to be able to see whether or not the values which we want to see are being encoded. And of course, the next question becomes, who determines which values supersede which values? So it's interesting. Yeah, I was wondering what your thoughts are.
Yeah, now we're really getting into a slippery slope. It's quite amusing. And I like that. Bringing in, Michael, the concept of explainability. We've been wrestling with this for decades now, or at least some of us have been wrestling with it for decades. The great thing about generative AI is that it's not really that new. It's all based on neural networks and, different things that are, orthogonal or complementary to neural networks. And, the research has really been racing forward in being able to see, these networks are very sparse. So when you go in and stimulate them in a certain way, this little part of the network activates. You stimulate it a different way, this little part of the network activates. So there's all sorts of research about how to decompose neural networks and then to understand those activation areas. That's a very intriguing area of research. And then there's been all sorts of, systems experimentation, I guess is the best way to say it, because it's certainly not anything that is production ready, of taking generative AI and foundational AI systems and putting them together and running them against each other to get insights and explainability. And causal AI is going to help out a lot in that area. And that's another area that's being experimented on right now. So explainability and transparency and interpretability is going to be a very intriguing area to watch, probably for the rest of my career. So the next 10, 20 years, there's going to be a lot going on in those areas. So while it's nascent at this point, I'm confident that we'll get to a point in the next 10 to 20 years where we can explain and understand how these models work at a quite detailed level.
Cool, that's nice, thanks.
So one of the things that we have at the moment is metadata, right? And we know that for every piece of data, we've got a ton of metadata, but that is storage, that's processing, that's all sorts of challenges like this. I should imagine that we are going to need a whole bunch more metadata fields to be able to control and manage how the AI is actually working. Do you have a set of metadata fields that you've had to create to assist you with this kind of thing, especially around the data quality side?
I agree with your general premise. We need a lot more metadata than we have today, and that's going to be costly. All you have to do is sit down with your CEO or chief executive or chairman or whatever when they are complaining about how much compute power and storage you're using, and just say, okay, well, if we don't do it, then we end up on the cover of the International Times or the Wall Street Journal or the FT for some kind of horrific breaches of ethics and lapse of focus and all this other kind of stuff. So the amount of money that we're going to have to pay to store metadata is nothing compared to the downside if we don't store it, which I know is a hard argument with some executives. As far as me having a set of metadata that I use, no, not really. I mean, I've built so many different systems and there's been so many different, perspectives on metadata. The real challenge is to look at each domain that you're working in and try to get out ahead of it and say, okay, how many perspectives on this do I need to understand? Do I need to understand lineage? More complex, do I need to understand, the metadata from a persona perspective? An employee persona, an executive persona, a customer persona, a regulator persona. I need to have metadata on all those different personas wrapped around the data that I'm going to use. So, moving outside of metadata to try to describe the physical attributes of the data and into the more multiple perspectives on how that data can be perceived and used is a challenge that I talk about quite a bit with people. And a lot of times you can see people walking away from that conversation more confused than they came into it, which I always feel bad about, but it's difficult to get your head wrapped around sometimes.
Indeed, and I think the enemy for us is always going to be time and the fact that things change and things decay, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And they don't decay all at the same rate, which is the other problem.
That would be great if everything, devolved in the same rate at the same time. That would be wonderful, but they don't. Yeah, I was having a conversation the other day with a person who was saying, well, we have fresh data, data that just came out of a system and it's wonderful, and then we have stale data, and that's data that's not useful. And I was like, okay, hold on, you're missing a huge part of the equation here. And I said, yes, you have fresh data, and you do have data that's a little older. Maybe it's like day old bread or something, a little stale, but soon that becomes history. So it depends on what you're using the data for. Fresh data is great and that's wonderful to get insights, but data that's a little older is great too. And then, you have historical data. So there is no data that doesn't have value at some point in its life cycle.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I was asked if I was to employ a data manager from somewhere in the business world, who would I choose? Which line of work? And I said, well, get me a supermarket manager. Because one of the key things they have to deal with is decay and the metadata around what the age of things are, management of moving things, storing things, destroying things, balancing the books, not throwing it away too early, not keeping it too long. It's really so often it's a very similar thing to that. That and gardening, of course, that's another one.
Well, if you can get a supermarket manager that can switch from cabbages to data, then I think your example holds quite well.
Okay. I think there are a few others that I'm sure would love to have something to say. Annie, I know that you mentioned anything from your side. I'm sorry to pick on you.
Yeah, hi. No
Hi.
problem whatsoever. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Ah, great. And guys, apologies. I've just gotten off a train from London. So apologies if it's a little bit noisy, but thanks, Howard. Some really good questions out there. And I really think, some of you, I teach some introductory Gen AI classes to young students. And I think a lot of the time I'll say to them, guys, let's train a model, and I'm going to give you data that says the world is flat. The world is flat. The world is flat. So please ask it, is the world flat? So some of you had that kind of argument, and it's always going to tell you the world's flat. And I think I've been in traditional AI for about 28 years, I guess. It's always about the data and the data management, and is the data good? As to the question, I think around is there sort of, I'm hearing, John, I don't know if you are, from some of the tech vendors that they do make with large language models these days, at least industry level libraries available to help you. So if it's insurance, whether it's retail, something like that, I've not worked with it, but this is kind of what they're promising, that they make those metadata libraries available to train you, to help with your Gen AI. I don't know how well those work. I haven't tried those, but certainly people like IBM, the Watsons and of the world, and those guys are saying that they can do this. I always and then somebody was asking about, you hear AI, everything's AI infused. I kind of, John, you were at Big Data London last year. We kind of just missed each other, but it's hilarious for me. I walk past these stands and I just see the same message, but with AI thrown in in the mix. My kind of BSO meter goes and says to them, show me some use cases. Not and you'll ask them, where have you done this? And they'll say, no, we can do. And I say, no, where have you done this? So I think that kind of making sure when you start working with these things is to have consultants and people who have done this before and actually have working use cases at reputable places. So certainly I can tell you in oil and gas industry, you guys who out in South Africa with De Beers, we've done some really cool stuff. We've done some really cool stuff with their general AI, but working with Gen AI in their security and intelligence environment with illicit diamond trade. So kind of worked, but we're using a lot of internally infused data. So yeah, that's my 2 cents worth, guys, from my side. Thank you. And John,
Annie,
lovely to see you.
Annie, great to hear you. And are you ever in South Africa anymore? You're here in Chicago. You're in London. It seems like you're a globetrotter.
I live in York. I live in Old York, not New York, in the UK. I'm back in South Africa. Actually, I'm flying on Friday, Howard. So I'll be back in South Africa for about 2 months.
Nice.
And so I've got some work with De Beers and British American Tobacco, and so I'll be back for 2 months, and I'm definitely going to come buy you a coffee in Cape Town in 2 weeks' time if you're available.
Excellent.
But yeah, John, I live in the UK now, travel to the US a lot with pharma projects. So,
Great.
but
Well,
still
we'll get
very
together
much in SA.
next time we're in a common city, we'll definitely get together.
Absolutely.
But yeah, your point is well made, is that, the AI washing is extensive, and the we can do it, but where have you done it? I love that line of discussion. And then, this whole idea that they're going to give us industry standard metadata, gets to the conversation that we were just having a few moments ago. That's their view of metadata. That's not your view of metadata. These industry standard, libraries are just a point in time and something that someone thought was a good idea. So I'm not saying don't use them. What I'm saying is vet them heavily, because you may have a completely different perspective on these data sets and data sources and integrations than they do. So while they're touting they have something, it may not be applicable or relevant to you.
I fully agree, John. I mean, just trying some of, whatever a company was saying is in their own libraries, and again, how out of date that can get. Just if you look at acronyms and definitions and SOPs within a company, difficulty to have with that. I really am a little bit skeptical about industry libraries.
I am too. One of the other projects that I worked on just as I was leaving EY, I worked on it for almost over a year, I guess, is that we were building our own domain language model for tax. And, if you go talk to anybody about these large language models, at the time, at least a year ago, you needed 7 billion words to train a model. And that's a lot of words. We went out and looked at the top 37 countries in the world and gathered up all their tax codes, every bit of their tax code, and that was 2 billion words. We were 5 billion words short. So we're like, wow, how can we make this up? So what we did is we went to the courts. So we collected as much tax law and tax, litigation as we possibly could, and that got us to almost 7 billion words. So we had enough, information to train our own tax model, and we did, and it worked exceptionally well. So if you can get a large enough corpus of relevant information, it's not hard to create your own large language model.
Great.
Yeah, I think, John, the amazing thing about the way you did that was it's a very regulated, very structured set of data that you went to. Going to tax, that's kind of, it has to be right. Otherwise,
it has to be.
There's
no equivocation on tax.
No, exactly. And actually their definitions and terminology is pretty standard and static. I think you run into trouble when you get into some of these other industries and things. But yeah, nice.
A lot fuzzier.
Okay. Anybody else? Rob Jackson, anything from your side? Maybe not. Adam, I know you always have an interesting question.
No, I think it's really just fun hearing a lot more realistic take on it, to avoid, like has been raised, the kind of whitewashing or AI washing.
There's a lot
you
of that.
see everywhere.
Well,
that makes me feel a lot more realistic, hopeful.
Well, I'm glad. That's kind of the point of these sessions, is to give you a practical, pragmatic view of what's really going to happen, as opposed to all this hyperbole and doom. All this idea of doom and gloom. Things are a lot more promising than people are letting on. If we could just get away from the vendors trying to sell us just ridiculous things and build things like we have always built. It's a golden age for people in data and analytics. There's no doubt about it. We're just barely getting off the ground, in a curve that is upward into the right motion. I did look in the meeting chat, and I see Rob has put something out there, asking about research, knowledge sharing, next book, family time. Everybody connect with me on LinkedIn. That's where I post all my material. That I'm out there daily talking about things that I've done, that I believe in, that I'm frustrated with, that I think is never going to happen. I'm almost a fire hose of what I'm thinking there. This book just got out the door. I hope a few of you are motivated to go buy it. And if you would, I'd be grateful if you could put a review on Amazon about your impressions about the book. I do have the next book in mind. And I think William talked about the theme in that, or maybe even Howard was talking about the theme, that people take things off the internet and they take things out of models and they don't think about them in a critical sense. I think there's a real loss of critical thinking around the world. So my next book is going to be on the role of critical thinking in the age of AI.
Thank you. So that answers Rob. Michael, anything more from your side?
Yeah, just the final point that you mentioned about AI washing everything. It sort of brings me to this place about commercial AI applications versus democratization. So on the path to AGI, the question becomes, if we were to think about the future, is it easier to envision a world in which AGI is available to everyone and owned by no one? Or will it devolve into some kind of a turf war where people have their own, I would call them, AI ecosystems, but they also require, pay to play type scenarios? Because I remember somebody was talking about a movie they watched whereby they asked the AI and said, would AI be useful to us in the future? And the AI said, not to you. You will just be more like a data point, something like that. So it's an interesting thought.
A very typical AI answer. Not to you because you'll be dead.
Exactly.
That
You'll just
kind
be
of
a data
thing.
point. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
or they'll be used by somebody more powerful than you, and you'll be just there for them to
Yeah.
harvest your data or something like that. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are, because
Yeah.
there's a lot of AI, because DeepSeek with the whole DeepSeek issue, people were talking about the fact that now AI is really open to everyone. But on the other hand, it's not. If you're training a domain language model with 7 billion words, you're going to need some serious compute to do that. So
Yeah, that's true.
in some cases, not everyone can do that. So there's also then a
Yeah.
natural limit to what you can do without certain types of resources. So it's just curious discussion. I was thinking what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I think, the one thing that I'm very excited about is that we're 120 years away from AGI, because I don't think we have anywhere near the governance, the structures, the understanding, the societal, friction points, to actually handle AGI if it arrived any sooner. So I don't think it's anywhere near our doorstep. But your question was more along the lines of, or your statements were more along the lines of, will AGI be available, on a widespread basis? And I think the answer is yes. And the sad thing about it is the reason it'll be available on a widespread basis is because governments will see it as a tool. So governments and companies and those kind of people will try to develop their own AGIs. And whoever gets there first, whether it's South Africa or the United States or China or Russia or whoever gets there first, will certainly have an advantage, but they won't be the only ones. We see now, DeepSeek came out, then Manus came out, then, every week something else is coming out. And I don't see that dynamic changing as we go forward, and even into the future after I'm long gone. I expect it to continue on. So, AGI is, in my mind, is a very exciting prospect, but it's something we're certainly nowhere near ready for.
Okay, well, thanks.
Which
I was
raises
thinking more
a
about the
really
journey.
interesting. Sorry, carry on.
It's about
No,
the
no,
journey.
Karen. I was just saying, I was thinking about the journey, because I know that, as you said, it's far away. And I was just thinking, as the journey evolves, there will be some key pivotal moments on the journey, or some key pivotal developments. And just putting everything together, or maybe you might even say that there are some things which have to happen before a certain thing happens. So the key prerequisites. And to the extent that you say something along the lines of, well, if you really want to have an AGI scenario where everything is democratized, what you're going to see is probably what we're seeing now, the proliferation of these open source challenging the dominance of maybe you'll see something along the lines of a realization by many of these big tech firms that they probably won't get the same ROI on their AI investments that they initially thought, because they won't be able to get away with charging people $200 a month or 20,000 or whatever it is. So it's just an interesting way of thinking about the way we converge to AGI, even if AGI itself is 100 years away.
Yeah, it's quite intriguing. You know, I have a lot of these, I do a lot of podcasts, I speak at a lot of events and keynote and sessions and panels and all those different kind of things. And, you know, I wouldn't say it's the majority, but a significant minority of the population then go, oh, if it's 120 years away, I'm not interested. It's too hard. It's not worth working on. And I find that really I just don't agree with that viewpoint. You know, for 70 years, we've been working on AI, and it's always been interesting and exciting. And I hold out that AI has been one of the most successful tech areas to ever be undertaken. So I think that the work on AGI, even though it's going to take quite some time, it's going to take quite some time because it's hard. And hard problems are exciting to work on. So I find that, you know, my contribution while I'm in this industry, I think is going to be quite crucial and quite important, and that excites me. And I know I won't be around to see it in the end, but then that's not a reason why I'm working on it. So, you know, I find the people that get downtrodden or depressed about it or demotivated, I'm like, I don't understand that perspective.
So in the movie Back to the Future, you get a really stark reality check between the jocks and the nerds, right? And the jocks had the mechanical cars. They knew exactly what was cutting with them. But as soon as the nerds got involved, we got computers, we got all those sort of things. But we also got a different type of thinking person. And different neural pathways entered into people's minds. Now, what I find fascinating, because there was definite step change, right? There was a step up change when you moved from the one to the other. And I think that the prevalence of the autistic children is going to create a step up that might bring that timeline a lot closer. But the same way as you have had the jocks struggling with the nerds, you're going to have the nerds struggling with the autistic kids.
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting way to look at it. You know, in my second book, Building Analytics Teams, which is the book I teach at Michigan, the University of Michigan, you know, I talk a lot about, you know, over the nearly 40 years that I've been working and managing analytics groups and teams and individuals, I would say almost the majority of the people that I've worked with have been on the spectrum. So, you know, this whole idea that there's this spectrum of normality, and right in the middle of the bell curve is what is normal and what people should shoot for. I find that slightly offensive, you know, because the people that I've worked with, while they're not quote unquote normal, have certainly been very bright and very inventive and very creative and driving things forward in a way that normal people couldn't do it. So I do think there is something to your argument there.
So one of the things that
William, yeah.
Carry on.
Well, William, yeah, you know, it's funny you should mention that. So for my sins, I long after getting my stats degrees and things like that, I actually did forensic psychology. But with Johannesburg Child Welfare, I lecture, or I used to counsel for a number of years young orphans and kids with sort of spectrum disorders in schools. For charity. And it's funny that you should say this. Two of the kids that were on the spectrum kind of was sent to me because they were struggling with their math class, and it was kind of just the routine and teaching the teacher how to teach them, and they became the top ones. So it's kind of that, you know, and you know, certainly most of my colleagues and friends for more than 25 years are statisticians, brilliant musicians, good at math. It's a funny sort of analogy, but you know what I used to say to the parents, and that's a very important thing, is exactly what John was alluding to, is there's no such thing as normal. I'm a statistician by trade. There's no such thing. There's a range of different capabilities, And I certainly think that the realm we're in and the realm AI and AGI is into is a realm that's kind of for people on those edges. I think
That's
sometimes.
exactly
So
right. I'm slightly autistic myself, and so the website I run is Multidimensional Thinkers, because it's my passion to get people to be able to think past the list, past the matrix, past the cube, into being able to bring lots and lots and lots of different dimensions in at the same time. And I think
Hey, Rob, are you familiar with the concept of a buckyball?
No.
If you look at Buckminster Fuller's architecture, he used to build these things. They look like Death Stars.
Yeah.
And I always think of those as that is a conceptual space. And if you drive, axes through that in multiple different places, then you end up with the thinking you're talking about. It's a very interesting multi-dimensional visual perspective to show people that all these different things can come together in one space and have a very interesting, outcome. So, I've always said that, of the 100+ systems that I've built and put into production, the most successful ones are the ones that have upwards of 10 to 20 different data sources integrated together. And that's where we need to go. That's what we need to do.
When I do my intros for looking for work, or when I'm talking to people, because I have to give people a bit of a preface when I speak to them, otherwise they think I'm being a bit obnoxious and all the rest of it. But if you wanted to see all sides of the football at the same time, well, you'd have a problem, right? Because it's spherical, unless you're the center dot. The problem is, as the center dot, your world is concave and it doesn't have color. Everybody else's world is convex and it has color, but they can only see a part of it. And so whenever I join a company, I have to actually find a translator, somebody who really knows the business really well, so that when I speak about this or that, which sounds completely disparate and completely in the wrong places, they get, okay, I can see how this actually joins the dots. But that's me. And I think there's a lot of kids like that.
There's more than people realize.
Yeah. I mean, up until the age of 55, I would have a bit of a panic attack if somebody just came and moved my mic, right? Until the psychologist said to me, the problem is your entire world is in you. If somebody touches it, they're touching you. So you have to just say, yes, you can take the mug, and you've got to then almost make it disappear out of your realm. And then they can take the mug and move it. But it's a completely different skill set. And I believe a lot of these kids have got it.
Yeah, I think they do. And, when this is the first time I've been teaching at Michigan, and I've got a class of students, and, I've had so many of them come to me in office hours and say, you're the first person that's talked to me like you understand who I am.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, brilliant. This has been such a great conversation. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
It's quite interesting, guys. John, John, Paul Brook and the guys from Dell. I guess they were in your team at Dell. I work and speak. I work with them often, speak to them often, and actually Dell sponsored here in the UK a competition which was about robotics and AI, right? And at the schools, and very interestingly, William, so they went to 3 or 4 really posh schools. And they went to 3 or 4 schools where kids had learning difficulties, and they put a challenge out there to use AI to direct robots and things like that. And Paul was actually saying to me that the schools where they did better were the young schools where kids had to really hustle and had learning disabilities, and they won the challenge. So it shows you about that multidimensional thinking and having to hustle, to get things done. I think there's I'm a true, my blood is green, a true South African at heart, and that's the spirit is there for having to make do and get stuff done. And I think you kind of take it everywhere. So when you grow up with that, I think it gives you those skills immediately.
Yeah, that's true. Michael?
Yeah, so back to the initial, so the prior discussion about neurodivergence and things like that. So that's actually something that's been really close to me, because I've been thinking, how can we use AI to make us, quote unquote, more normal? And I know that Annie talks about the statistical improbability of normal, but I mean to do the things that society values the most. So, for example, yeah, unfortunately, in my case, I had a twin diagnosis of both ADHD and ASD, but I kind of thought, this is just nonsense. I don't have to believe this. I don't have to go with that. But at the same time, I was thinking, people who suffer from this thing, again, yeah, sorry, that was just me being a bit dismissive. I truly believe that these things exist, but my attitude at the time was that this is just not something I should use to hold me down. I should, carry on regardless. And this made me think about the fact that AI could be helpful to those people who are challenged in the way or another, to sort of make them a little bit more, to fit in more, simply to fit in more to society. And yeah, so that's a very interesting discussion as well.
To Rob's point, the different perspective, and I love that metaphor, being in the ball as opposed to being outside the ball. We could use AI to say, hey, here's how I think this is. Here's what my reality is, and describe it to the model, and then say to the model, describe this back to me how a normal person would see it. And you could use the model to translate, and you could actually say to the model, I'm going to put in how I see the world, and I want all your responses to come back as if you were a Cambridge professor, and I want to understand how that, I'm just using that as a persona, I want to understand how they would see the same thing I'm seeing. So AI can definitely be a translator for people who have a different perspective. I went to work for this one company once, and they had me take a battery of tests. And, the person that was running the testing center, when I was done, called me and said, can you come back in? And I said, sure. Did I do something wrong? Did I not put my name in the right place or something? And I got there, and the person said to me, on these set of tests, you're like beyond the world. You're like in the top 0.5% of people that take this test. For this other set of tests, you're a moron. It's like you can't even understand what we're asking you. And I just laughed, and I'm like, I'm undiagnosed, but I'm sure I'm somewhere on the spectrum.
No, I got told by the Herman brain thing, you're the first person who actually can only do logic and only do high level thinking. You've got no way to communicate this. I don't know how you guys survive, but anyway, there you go. And I mean, there you go. But I can work at level 8 of detail. Most people can't get down to 4, right? And I'm very comfortable down in the deep plumbing, So we all have our little space, The deeper you go, the more of a rat you are, of course. But there you go.
Well, this has been
no offense to anyone, right? Because when I said I dismissed the spectrum thing, when I was a kid, people were saying to me all sorts of things, and my dad just said to me, just ignore all of that and don't give yourself an excuse to fail. So
you can't have an excuse. I agree with you there. I've seen it as an opportunity. I've seen it as a fantastic opportunity to show people that they can't see. Most people can only think, level 1, 2, 3 levels of logic. They can't get down to the detail. And that's where the devil is, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Well, this has been a wonderful conversation, Howard. Thank you for setting this up. I've really enjoyed it.
Thanks, John. Thanks, John. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for all your contributions. John, if you don't want to answer, I will do the answer. But do you have someone that you feel should get the book?
Oh man, it's been such a wonderful conversation. I think you'd have to go between Rob and Michael.